documents in the 17th century and 18th century. It's true that a certain number of Arabs arrived in Palestine in the 19th century as a result of movements of population in the Ottoman Empire. So you have 5 villages, for example, of Bosnians in Palestine at the end of the 19th century. You've got 2 villages called El Misr in Palestine in the beginning of the 20th century, meaning they came from Egypt. Misr being the Egyptian name for Egypt. So there were people coming into Palestine. In the 20s and 30s, a lot of migrants came in just for seasonal work, to pick oranges or pick this or pick that. But there wasn't much official immigration. There was almost none. It's several hundred per year came officially as immigrants into Palestine, as opposed to thousands of Jews who came in officially. And there was a certain number of illegal immigrants, but nobody knows how many. And as I say, many of them were seasonal, not real settlers. So what you have at the end of 47, which is what we're talking about, is not really very many newcomers from outside, but really original native inhabitants descending from earlier centuries. So I think it's wrong. If Gilbert writes that there was massive Arab immigration into Palestine, it's not true. There were 600,000, there were about 450,000 Arabs in Palestine in the 1880s. There were 650,000 in 1919, 1920, when the British more or less counted them. And from those 650,000, you end up with 1.2 million in 1947. And this would seem to be more or less a normal rate of increase, given the better health conditions and so on, under the British mandate. Not as a result of mass immigration, but as a result of procreation and survival rates among children.
Yeah, I mean,
He
does say it's comparable to, close to the Jewish number.
No, it's not true.
It's not
the immigration is not true.
Okay.
And nobody actually knows. I'm saying this with limited liability in the sense that if there was a large immigration, it would be illegal and therefore unreported. Right. But I think that statisticians have worked out that the growth rate from 1919 to 1947 is fairly normal. The numbers are fairly normal given survival rates and so on, and cannot be as a result of immigration. Wait, no, there's several other things.
Yeah,
trying to find where I wrote them down. One second.
Why did the Americans and British think?
I don't know. Look, intelligence agencies always make mistakes. Israel didn't think the Arabs were going to attack in 1973, and they did attack. So intelligence services make mistakes. I think the British and the French, I don't know about the Americans, but the Americans probably relied on the British. So the British thought they had trained a good army in Jordan. They had trained the Iraqi and Egyptian armies and armed them. They knew the Haganah didn't have heavy weapons, artillery, tanks, combat aircraft. So they figured, well, the intelligence appreciations are that if the Zionists end up fighting the Palestinian Arabs, they will beat them. But if they fight the Palestinian Arabs and invading Arab armies, they will lose. And I think they were probably motivated by the fact that they had heavy weaponry and the Jews didn't. This is what I assume. But as we know, it was a mistaken assumption. What was the third thing you said?
I just mentioned the language of Resolution 189.
No. All in Palestine during the 20s, 30s, and 40s lived residents of Palestine, which was a British mandate territory, and they all had ID cards which said Palestine resident, whatever. So Jews and Arabs were Palestinians. Right. It's only after 48. And much later, in fact, the Palestinians begin to call themselves, the Palestinian Arabs, or the Arabs of Palestine, begin to call themselves Palestinians. This term was never used in the 30s or 20s by the Palestinians. They didn't call themselves Palestinians. They called themselves Arabs, and if they were asked where they were residing in Haifa, Jaffa, whatever, which were part of Mandate Palestine. It's a modern term, essentially. Right. Somewhere from the 50s it begins to appear. Palestinians are Palestinian Arabs. And Jews, of course, no longer call themselves Palestinians because they have a state, Israel, they're Israelis.
Thank you.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about the Arab-Palestinian discourse about 48? And I mean especially regarding the term Nakba and the recent discussion about it, the Arab-Palestinian side.
Well, look, 1948 is called by the Palestinian Arabs and henceforward by the Arab world in general the Nakba, which means the disaster. And what happened to them in 48 was a disaster both for the Palestinians and then the Arab armies who invaded, who lost the war. So this was a big disaster, especially when you think that they were fighting 700,000 Jews, not the Soviet Union or the Americans. You know, this is a terrible humiliation and disaster. Well, there's a number of different things I can say. One of them is often you will find in Arab historiography or commentaries about 48, you will find that the war actually begins on the 15th of May 1948, not on the 30th of November 1947. In other words, they usually count the war as happening from the moment the Arab armies invade Palestine, and they sort of completely obliterate or omit the civil war between the two sides which preceded the Pan-Arab invasion. And they do that because if they said there was a civil war between the two sides, they would have to say, how did it begin? Who launched it? Who is responsible for the disaster which befell them? And if they say it's the Palestinians began the war, and then the Palestinians suffered disaster, refugeedom and so on, it would be they were culpable. So they sort of omit that part, and they basically say, before May 48, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled, and then the Arab states invaded, maybe to save the Palestinians or help them. But they don't say that the Palestinians actually initiated the war in November, December 1947. So that's one thing which I think is important. The second thing is that they say that, well, Zionism is seen as a type of colonialism, or if you like, an agent of imperialism. And were supported, which explains why the Palestinians and the Arabs lost the war. If they were agents of the British and the Americans, well, they had this enormous backing, and the Soviets also joined them. They had this enormous international backing, therefore they won the war and we lost the war. Or therefore we had no choice but to leave Palestine or become refugees because the force against us was so overwhelming. That's one of the parts of the Palestinian narrative. And it omits several important facts, which are facts, not opinions or interpretations. One is that the British opposed partition and opposed Jewish statehood. They abstained in the vote on the 29th of November 47 at the UN, and they did not support the establishment of the State of Israel, and in some way certainly armed the Arab states, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt until the end of May 1948. And their officers served as the commanders of the Jordanian army throughout the war. So the British in some way supported the Arabs, though it's not true, as Gurion thought, that they supported the Arabs to destroy the Jews. They didn't want that as an outcome of the war, but they didn't support Jewish statehood and sort of bowed reluctantly to the will of the international community and sort of said, okay, there should be a Jewish state, maybe slightly smaller than what the United Nations had allocated. That was essentially British policy through 48. And in serving that, they helped the Arabs in some way in the course of the war. They didn't support them if their aim was to destroy the Jewish state. That's important. But in the Arab memory and in the Arab national consciousness, the British are the villains, the foreign villains of the peace, because they supported the Balfour Declaration, they sustained and nurtured the Zionist enterprise for 3 decades, so the Arabs will say, and supported the Jews in the 48 war, which is totally wrong. But this is how they remember it. The Americans, again, here there's a fact, the Americans did support politically under Truman, did support the partition resolution and did recognize the State of Israel first among the nations, but didn't support the State of Israel militarily. So in other words, in some ways it was like half support. It wasn't real support. But this again is omitted by the Arabs. The Americans began to support Israel with arms in the 1960s. That's when actual American support really came in. Under Truman it was half-hearted, though there was some political support, but no military support. Under Eisenhower it was very cold-shouldered Israel. Only under Kennedy and Johnson did they become strategic partners or supporters of Israel. But this is omitted in the Arab narrative, and certainly of the Nakba. America supported Israel. You won't see in any Arab book that the Americans did not provide the Jews with arms, as the British and French did supply the Arabs with arms in the first half of 1948. according to the Arab narrative, the Jews intended to expel the Arabs from Palestine. This was Zionist policy. This was Zionist ideology on which the policy was based. This was Zionist ideology, and they always intended to expel the Arabs. The story is much more complicated than that, but it basically is not true. The Zionist movement did not, as a movement, intend to expel the Arabs. There were Zionist leaders who, from the late 30s, supported some form of expulsion, but the movement, as a movement, never endorsed expulsion and believed, certainly until the late 30s, that immigration by Jews to Palestine would lead to a Jewish majority. Not expelling the Arabs, but lots of Jews would come from Eastern Europe. World War II killed that, because it killed 6 million Jews. So the Jews then, from that point on, you can think maybe no longer relied on mass Jewish immigration to bring about the Jewish majority in Palestine or part of it, and maybe thought of expulsion, but the fact is it was never endorsed as a policy in 48 and wasn't carried out in the first 5 months of the 48 war. It's only in May that you begin to encounter, in April 48, it's only then that you begin to encounter expulsions of Arab villages and townspeople, only in April 48, which is 5 months after the start of the war initiated by the Palestinian Arabs. And from that point on, as I say, it's not policy, but a lot of the commanders and a lot of the politicians want that to happen. Now, as I say, the Arab narrative says it was expulsion, premeditated, ideologically based, and consistently carried out, and this is not true. Because as we know, the Galilee and large parts of the country remained at the end of the war with large Arab populations. Had it been consistent, real government policy, all the Arabs would have been driven out. There was no problem. If 700,000 were driven out in the course of the war, driving out another 400,000 or 500,000 or 160,000, as remained in Israel at the end of the war, wouldn't have been a big problem. Drive out 700,000, you can drive out another 160,000, no problem. That didn't happen. So I don't think it was consistent. It wasn't government policy. There was inconsistency in the way that the IDF behaved in certain areas. But as you say, there is an Arab narrative which says they wanted to throw them all out, and that's what they did in 48 with premeditation. There's other probably elements to the Arab narrative, but I've talked about a number of them.
So, Gregory, then Gabe, and then anybody else?
I don't know. It's just interesting to hear what you're saying about this, and how do we as scholars fighting anti-Semitism deal with this. Earlier in the week, Dan talked about brought up the notion of intentionality and functionality, and something else regarding Nazi policies on ghettos and extermination of the Jews. And there was a policy of removal, I guess, from Mein Kampf onwards, but not necessarily the final solution wasn't there at the beginning. It came there, and then one thing was happening here, and another thing was happening there, and another thing was happening there. And you have just said, and I realize what I'm saying is awful, but one thing was happening there, another thing, and it wasn't a plan, and yet there's this narrative from the Arabs that it was there. And so I'm not saying they're equivalent, I'm not saying anything like that, but I'm saying people are probably, if I can see sort of resonances or echoes or something that might be structural similarities or history, because that's what it is, it's history, happening in a certain way and being described in a certain way in two different situations. And then I just want to throw in there the idea that you apparently said, according to Steve, and you reiterated, if the Palestinians have been absorbed by Jordan, or if the Jews have been pushed into the sea, the Middle East would be much quieter, and that's obviously a provocation, I'm assuming, but at the same time people latch onto that idea and say, it's up to the Jews to get out of the Middle East and have things quiet down. So it seems to me that there's this evident possibility of appropriation of, let's say, the historical record towards anti-Semitic discursive and material ends. And so is there any discussion of that or thought of that, or how might we deal with that?
Look, I would say the basic difference, what you're talking about is the genocide versus what happened to the Palestinians in the 48th century. The essential difference is there's a conflict between two national groups, two ethnic groups, two national groups, eventually two states or a number of states in Palestine over Palestine. And the result is hundreds of thousands of people are uprooted from their homes. This isn't the same as a large nation destroying a small minority intentionally, gas chambers, etc. Completely different. The second thing is, and I mentioned that before, one also should really attribute responsibility to who begins what. Now you could say, and I'm not going to dispute that, no Zionism, no Nakba. In other words, if there's no Zionist influx and enterprise and coming to Palestine, there would not be a conflict with the Arabs, and therefore there would not be this disaster which befell the Arabs. And this is totally, completely true. There wouldn't be any Arab-Israeli conflict if there was no Zionist movement. That's certainly true. But you can say that given that there is a Zionist movement, or if you like, given that there's a legitimacy to the Jews trying to re-establish their ancient state and their ancient homeland, if there's legitimacy to that, then the problem boils down to 47, at which point the Arabs begin the war, and you can say no war, no Nakba. If the Arabs had not begun the war, the Palestinians, the Jews accepted a compromise, dividing the country between the two peoples. The Arabs said no. Palestinians and Arabs started shooting. Arab states join them in the war and start shooting, and they lose the war. What can you do? There's a Nakba. There's a disaster on the Arab side. So it depends how you start counting history in that sense. But that's an essential difference. Who starts the conflict and what's the conflict about? In Germany, there is no conflict. There's a persecution of a very small minority by a very large minority, persecution which ends with the murder of 6 million people. In Palestine, very few people were actually killed. That's also important maybe to say. There's a war. Thousands are killed on both sides. The Jews suffer, I don't know, 6,000 dead altogether in the war, which is 1% of the population, which incidentally is a very large percent of the population. If 1% of the Americans were killed in the war, we're talking about 30 million dead. 30 million dead today. So 1% of the Jewish population in Palestine as dead.
30 million.
Sorry, 3 million. Sorry, you're right. I actually failed in math. I was not bad in history, but I did fail in math. 3 million. But no, 3 million is a fairly large number also. Sorry, 3 million is a fairly large number. When you consider, incidentally, America had 55 or 58,000 dead in Vietnam over a 10-year period, it's really very small losses compared to a nation of 150 million at the time. Here we're talking about 1%. So the Israelis had a lot of dead. Palestinian dead, we don't know how many there were in 1948. Though Haj Amin al-Husseini at some point later said there were 12,000 Palestinian dead. So you can say that almost all of them, or half of them, were combatants. Some of them were civilians, as on the Jewish side. Some of the 6,000 dead, a quarter, were civilians. You can say that several hundred, maybe as many as 800 or 900, were massacred by Jews in 48. The massacres all told, and there were massacres on both sides, from both sides, but altogether 800 or 900 Arabs died in massacres, prisoners of war, civilians deliberately killed. That's very, very small numbers in a war for survival or a war between two peoples over a piece of land. You know, in Srebrenica and modern-day Yugoslavia, the modern enlightened Europe, you've got 9,000 dead in 2 days, murdered by, you know, Christians and murdering Muslims or whatever it was. So in 800, 900, in a long war, which was started by the Arabs, initiated by the Arabs, with the Jews feeling they're going to be thrown into the sea, is no big deal. It's chicken feed compared to modern large massacres. So what I'm saying is, when you compare, talking about genocide and talking about, here you've got a war between two peoples, some civilians get killed, even some are massacred, but we're talking really very small numbers. Even if you accept Haj Amin al-Husseini's total of 12,000, it's not very large numbers in a population of 1.2 or 1.3 million. And it's a war which they initiated. What happens? That's what happens in wars. People get killed. And the side which loses suffers. That's what happens. That's quite normal.
Right.
Yeah, there's a price to war, to going to war.
So this is somewhat related. Have we got to accept the term Nakba then, which the way that it's deployed is meant to resonate as some kind of analogy to the Holocaust? And that aside, what's the catastrophe supposed to be? Was it that they fled, or that the Jewish state was established? And we just got to...
No, the catastrophe is they lost Palestine. They
Right.
thought Palestine was theirs,
Right.
which it wasn't really. They actually lived there, but it was ruled by the British and by the Turks. But they lost Palestine in a war which they had initiated. In other words, they lost a war. And 700,000 were uprooted. So that's the catastrophe.
Do we use that term then, Nakba? Is that a historically valid term?
That's not up to me. I mean, that's up to whoever wants to use it. You can use it.
Yeah.
If you don't want to use it, don't use it. I would simply say the 48 war was a war. It was the 1948 war. That's the term I use. The Arabs want to call it Nakba, they can call it Nakba. The Israelis want to call it their war of independence, which they do. They can call it the war of independence. I don't use that phrase either. I call it the 1948 war, which I think is a neutral term to define that war. It was the 1948 war.
And how do you feel about the term ethnic cleansing, given what you said earlier, which was very important, I think, about the 30s, the 40s versus now? Ethnic cleansing is a term from the Yugoslavian conflict, I think, in the 90s. Is it a valid term? Ilan Pape uses it in his title of his book.
Yeah.
I mean, I see what you're saying, that it's sort of whatever people call things is what they get called, but is it the right term, ethnic cleansing?
I've been asked that about, was what Israel did to the Palestinians in the course of the war ethnic cleansing, and I would say there was a partial ethnic cleansing. Why do I say partial? In one or two places, or in a number of places, especially Lydda and Ramla, the most significant, there was expulsions. So to that extent, there was an ethnic cleansing of Arabs in Lydda and Ramla and several other sites. But I wouldn't say what happened is an ethnic cleansing, because the majority of Arabs left their homes, fled from their homes as a result of the war, not somebody going there and ordering them out. That's what ethnic cleansing is. Most of them left their homes as a result of the war, not of a policy. There was no policy of ethnic cleansing. And most, as I say, left of their own volition as a result of fear of war. You could say, and that's the problem here, that when Israel decided not to allow back refugees, and that's what it decided from the middle of the 48 war, even before the war had ended, and before the full number had become refugees, Israel had decided not to allow mass refugee return. You can say that that decision not to allow them back, taken from June 48 and reiterated by the Israeli government afterwards, you can say that's an expulsive decision. But that the whole thing, one could call it ethnic cleansing, I think that's a misnomer when applied to what happened, because it's very piecemeal, very incidental. It depends where, what, months, places, different things happen. Most people leave as a result of fear of war, not because they're actually kicked out on orders, like expel them and they go. That's not what happens.
You were never, though. Oh, never mind. Okay. I'll wait.
I have another part to that.
Let's
Three
get-
part
There's
question.
always these people with third parts.
It's not three questions. It's,
20-part question.
one. Could you, if you were able to get into those closed, I'm really curious about this, Arab archives, were you to be able to get in there, were they open to you? What would you be most interested in looking for? What would you?
No, there's a number of different things. Firstly, the intention of the Arab armies in invading on the 15th of May would be very interesting. What the cabinets discussed before the invasion, what the governments told their commanders to do when they invaded, that would be very important. Secondly, well, I don't know what it says. I would be interested to see what the documents tell us was the intention of the leaders and the intentions of the military commanders and their orders down the chains of command. I'd also be interested in knowing their attitude to the Palestinian refugees. That is, what were they encouraging refugees to leave? Were they interested in having this excuse for invasion? Because that was used by the Arab armies as an excuse to invade on the 15th of May, that the Israelis were badly treating or mistreating the Palestinians. Was that one of their motivations in going into Palestine? What, in fact, was their attitude to the Palestinian refugees along the line? So that's also an interesting question. Also, I would be interested in knowing what they thought of the Israelis. That is, how did they relate to the Israelis? What was their estimation of the Israeli strength, military forces? That would also be very interesting. But war aims would be the most important thing I would look for.
Eddie, any
Yes, I want to share a comment about the term of Nakba, Palestinian Nakba, and the term, what I just said about the Palestinian. I think, and I know, that the Mufti encouraged the Arabs to go.
It's not true. Not
I have
true.
documents.
have
I read
documents also.
Arabic.
It's good that you read
it's
Arabic,
good.
but there is no such
I
document.
also,
There is no such
if you want
document.
to, American also, the journalist, American journalist, I forgot his name, Christian, not, he said this, he wrote this. This is one comment. Second comment, I want to share with my fellows what is the Palestinian Nakba. The Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian claims or they want to be compensated and they want the law of return. They want to return to Palestine. So we, as Israeli, as Jews, we have to say, sorry, you couldn't kill us. I have to pay you, compensate you money, and come take your homeland. This is the Palestinian so alleged Nakba. There's no Palestinian Nakba. The real Nakba is the Jewish Nakba. I came from an Arab country. I was persecuted by the Arabs. 1 million Jews have been persecuted, and we lost our assets, about $400 billion the assets. The Palestinians didn't have such assets. The Palestinian in the Arab country, I read some secret files. Every local, for example, when the Palestinians refugee, when the Arab refugees were in Lebanon, the Lebanese saw the Palestinians or the Arabs taking money from UNRWA, taking sugar. So everyone wanted to be refugee. And these workers of UN, they don't know Arabic. So everyone, oh, I'm from Haifa. So you can register. So the numbers, there is a lot of miscalculated numbers. This is my comment and also my question to you.
Well, there is an argument about the number of Palestinian refugees, as there is an argument about almost every aspect of what happened in 48. And the Israelis at the time, in 48, or at the end of 48, claimed that there were altogether something like 500,000 Palestinian refugees. And the Arabs claimed normally that there were 900,000 or 1 million. And the UN sent 2 teams to investigate the numbers. You're right, probably some of them didn't know Arabic, maybe some of them did know Arabic. In 1949 and 1950, these 2 teams of experts looked at the numbers, tried to check the numbers, and came up with the numbers 711,000 or 726,000. That was the numbers the UN reached in its investigation of how many Palestinians actually became what they called refugees. The term, incidentally, is a misnomer, because the Oxford dictionary, for example, defines a refugee as somebody who is forced from his home or leaves his home as a result of religious persecution, war, etc., but not his home, his country. And since most of the refugees, so-called refugees, left their homes in Jaffa and moved to Gaza, or left their homes in Nazareth and moved to Jenin, they remained in Palestine. Most of the refugees moved from one part of Palestine to another, not out of Palestine. Only a third moved out of Palestine to Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So the term refugee is a bit problematic, and it's certainly problematic in relation to their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Okay, displaced persons. They were displaced from their homes, that's for sure. But there is an argument about the numbers. It's insoluble. There's no way of solving it. Certainly, probably what you write, that some of them misinformed. The UN wanted to receive UN rations. They claimed rations for dead people who were dead, no longer alive, so they inflated the numbers a bit. But the number 700,000 is probably just about right. Probably. There's no way of knowing. As to the rest, I have no comment.
About the Jewish Nakba, what do you think about the Jewish Nakba?
Well, we've never called it the Nakba. I talked about that before. I said Jewish communities were intimidated into flight from the Arab countries by their Arab neighbors and by the Arab governments. They lost a lot of property as a result, very large amounts of property, and probably should be compensated if there is ever, like the Palestinian Arabs who lost property, should be compensated if ever there is a compromise solution, a settlement. That's what I would say on that.
Thank you.
Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
I'm always willing, because I'm always a
No,
committee.
you're so nice
referee.
about it, and everyone lets you speak, so go ahead.
Oh, that's a ladies' club.
I'm old enough to
Hey,
be.
I'm older than you.
Well, but still, I'm old enough to be that way.
Okay. It's not really a question, so I'm going to not really make a question. It's really a couple of comments. One is, I appreciate, One is vicariously over time, I appreciate one of the things that you did, Benny Morris. I'm speaking now for my mother who died a year ago, which was she grew up, I grew up, my generation grew up with the idea that the Haganah went around with loudspeakers and begged the villagers to stay. And we all did.
Right.
And when your book came out, it was a revelation that was difficult for you to make, and it was difficult to
I
read.
didn't say it was difficult for me to make.
No, well, that's how we view it. That's not what you think. A lot of things are about representations, and therefore it was like this. It came down. You know, you can't. Benny Morris is coming out of a perspective that's not ideological, and therefore, if this is what the archives have shown, that beautiful story wasn't quite the story, it means that we have to be sensitive in a very different way. So I want to give that as a compliment and, appreciation. The second comment is about historical representations and folding back into curricula, and just simply, it may be a lost battle. But nevertheless, the image out there, and it is now deeply rooted, and I don't know how to remove it at this point, except on an individual basis, is Israel is a European outpost, period. Part of that narrative is a narrative that within Israel is responsible for. Different Israeli governments are responsible for. It's not the narrative of my grandfather who went to visit Jaffa, that's what once I'm at, who went to Jaffa because my grandmother knew the war was going to happen, that she sensed it, and she turned out to be right, and came back to my mother, who was 3 at the time, 4 at the time, very precocious, and said, wow, from Jaffa, wow, these are the people of the Bible. And the image that went out and was there was the Shoshana Damari image, I call it. Brown-skinned people, and the Jews, the 4 corners of the world, look like the people in their host countries. So you've got the blondes in Scandinavia, and you've got the Ethiopians, and you've got the Indians, and so forth. That image of that generation disappeared, and somehow mysteriously, over time, Israel became this Western country. Eastern Europeans became Western. The very people, my grandmother's mother was from Poland, her grandfather was from Germany. The German side had a apocalypse, when they married. That just didn't happen. But in Israel, Eastern European Jews became somehow Western and took over. And alongside that story, the story of what were called Afro-Asian Jews, and then become Eastern Jews, Oriental Jews, and then today Mizrahi Jews, that story disappears completely from the quote-unquote West. And when it does reappear, I'm sorry it takes so long, but when it does reappear, it reappears as an appendage, as passive people who sort of came to Israel because they were pushed out by their Arab neighbors, but there's no active Zionist movement. And so once again, we have reinscribed the story of European who were displaced because of a European problem, enter into Israel, and now the vocabulary of the 21st century is a vocabulary of white Jews, which in Hebrew has also been translated. Come into in Hebrew in Israel, ki Yehudim Levanim. Okay? Something that did not exist 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but does exist today. It is very commonly used. I do follow you. So my point here, my point here is the if we want to call it propaganda, if we want to call it interpretation, if we want to call it narratives of representation, the bottom line is there is a lost battle in the representation of Israel today. And that affects, certainly, I don't know how it is on European campuses, but it certainly is very significant on American campuses. So
there's a whole range of things I would say to different parts of what you said. And it's probably, I'm sure it's right, that is the thesis, what you're saying is correct, that Israel is represented as a European outpost and therefore colonialist and therefore whatever.
So the question would be, is there a corrective in your perspective?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a corrective. That's my bottom line. What I would say is this, that the Zionist movement, which was founded in Eastern or Central Europe, Herzl was sort of Central European, not Eastern European, but most of the foot soldiers were Eastern Europeans, the people who went and who supported Herzl. Herzl envisioned the state, and so did the Zionist leaders, as a European state. They wanted to establish a European state. They wanted to re-establish the ancient Judean kingdom, but as a modern European democracy, liberal democracy. That was the idea. And in that sense, Israel is responsible for its own image as a European outpost. That's what Herzl wanted to build. That's what Gurion hoped to achieve and said he wanted to achieve. The fact that half the Israeli population, or slightly more even at some point, from 1949 onwards, was of Oriental or Eastern European, Sephardi extraction, North African and Middle Eastern extraction, changed the demography of Israel to half European origin, half Oriental origin, but it didn't change the nature of the state, which the leaders, who were Ashkenazi, wanted to remain a European state. And they didn't say Eastern Europe wasn't Europe. They thought they were Europeans, even though they lived in the marshlands of Western Europe, not really in real, what we call European. But they saw themselves as European. And they did adhere to European ideologies of democracy, liberalism, as well as socialism and other things. These weren't Eastern European inventions, these are Central and Western European inventions, and that was the way they were brought up. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing is that with the charge, against the charge, and that's often made, that Israel is, Zionism and Israel are European colonial entities. I would say this is incorrect. And they're not, because the Zionist movement wasn't an agent of any empire or any colonial entity, and they didn't go as colonists for Britain. Britain is usually the power charged with being the father or the foster parent of this colonialist venture. It's true the British supported Zionism in 1917 and up to about 1937, but they weren't the initiators of the movement, and beyond these 2 years weren't the supporters or nurturers of this movement, except for those 20 years. The Jews went to Palestine as agents of the Jewish people. That's how they saw it. The Zionists saw themselves as the vanguard or the agents of a Jewish people resettling in its ancient land, not going to some third world country to exploit the natives or the natural resources, which didn't exist, of course, in Palestine. But they went as agents of a people who had been dispersed and displaced from their homeland, etc. So there is a problem with that because they were Europeans. In that sense, they were colonizers in a third world country who had come from Europe, and they established colonies. Their moshavot, their original settlements were called moshavot, and a moshava in Hebrew is a translation of colony. So they established colonies. Each moshava, each little settlement was called a colony. And they hoped to branch out from each of these colonies, each of these settlements of 200 or 300 people, to further colonies, to expand around the country. So the idea was expansionist. This is true. The whole Zionist enterprise was an expansionist enterprise. They wanted to settle certain places and then expand into as much as they could of Palestine. That was true. And the settlements they established were called by them colonies. But in the sense of being agents of an imperial power, they weren't. If it served their purposes, they were willing to play ball with Europeans like the British. But they weren't agents of the British, they were playing the British so that the British would help them in their enterprise. That's how it actually happened. And they certainly didn't go there to exploit natural resources, which is one of the bases of imperial colonization and so on, or even the natives. Much of the Zionist movement, in fact, was opposed to using Arab laborers because that would be exploitation, but also because they didn't want to be dependent on the natives for their well-being or for their security or whatever. So they resented or rejected the idea of using locals and exploiting them. And natural resources, as I said, there weren't any there. So it's a problem, because there's a number of different aspects to Zionism. As to the Mizrahi Jews, just let me add one thing. There was no real Zionist movement among the Mizrahi Jews, not in Iraq, not in Morocco, not in Syria. There was a few hundred youngsters who were Zionists, but they didn't go beyond that few hundred middle class in Casablanca or in Damascus. They weren't, the Jews of the Arab lands were not Zionists, they didn't want to come to Palestine. But what happened in 48 somehow generated enthusiasm and generated antagonism by the local Arab populations, which forced them to become Zionists and emigrate. In other words, they were chased out, and the only place they were willing to be accepted was in Palestine. Before 39, the Zionist movement never looked to Oriental Jewry for manpower. It never thought in terms of, we will bring the Jews from Morocco, from Tunisia, or from Yemen, etc. They were interested in Zionism, and the Zionists were not interested in them. But the killing of 6 million Jews in Europe killed the manpower of the Zionist movement, the potential manpower. And then the Zionists in Palestine and in Western Europe had to look somewhere to find manpower, because there wasn't enough to establish a state or to sustain a state after 48, and then they turned to Oriental Jewry. And as I say, Oriental Jewry in some way turned to Zionism, because in some way that was, you know, the will of God, the establishment of a Jewish state, and also because they had nowhere to stay, because they were being kicked out by their Arab neighbors and their Arab governments. So it's a bit complicated, but...
Well, it is complicated, and that complication really is complicated, but it's what makes all the difference in the world. Because if you tell the story as the Zionist movement is a European Jewish movement, that's one story. If you remind people that there were voices from the East consistently with the same rise of political nationalism that takes place at the end of the 19th century, that is a different story. When American Jews, who are several generations in the United States, and everybody else never hears the fact that there are Jews in Arab countries, that Arabic is not owned by Muslim Arabs, but there's a rich Jewish Arabic tradition. When they never hear that, when they never see Jews who are not dressed in suits or in the noble clothing of the 17th century, which is a perversion all of its own and a whole other discussion, then we have a problem with the way the history is being represented. So it's not 100% accurate to say that there... Obviously, Hashemel Tzia was not strong outside of Europe, but it existed. There was an ongoing Jewish presence in Jerusalem, in Sfat, in Tiberia, and they do not look like Europeans. They didn't imagine themselves. And Romanian artists of the 1920s and Hod, the pictures that remain do not have pictures in iconography that looks European. And all I'm suggesting here is that, and all the way around, is that the representations that have become sort of taken for granted as somehow Israel is mostly European, and yeah, you've got those Jews from the Arab countries who came, and the poor ones came and they got stuck and they're at the bottom, and the rich ones went to France and Canada, and now they're coming back to Israel as French Jews instead of as Francs, you know, or as Schwarze, the way they were described to my mother when people didn't know her background, that there's a domestic problem. I just think that this is something which is really, really important, and we shouldn't walk away this week without a clear understanding. It doesn't mean knowing everything, but a clear understanding that the Israeli population, despite what the Israeli government, who the Israeli government appoints in Western capitals, the picture is no less a group of people of color than those blonde, blue-eyed Syrians who on campuses around the United States and Canada get to call themselves people of color and are imagined as people of color. So that's what should be on to.
I have to say that I've had quite a few aha moments here, especially with your conversation, so thank you. I just had a comment. It was just a 2-second comment when you were talking about ethnic cleansing, and what I wanted to say was that based on my readings and reading about you and what people have written about you, that it seems to me using those...
It's all lies.
Well, using the words ethnic cleansing is hard for you to say, because I made a comment that based on my reading it was Ari Shavit who labeled you as someone, didn't he label you as someone in favor of ethnic cleansing? You know, and so they're not your words. Am I correct? I'm raising all sorts of...
I don't think you wrote that. I don't think you wrote that.
You know?
No. Okay. Check the interview. You didn't write that.
Okay.
In fact, I said in the interview that I oppose ethnic cleansing on political and moral grounds, speaking of the time I was writing, he was writing the interview,
Yeah.
2002 or whatever.
Well, what I heard was that your discussion about how you might have, if you advise Ben Gurion, or what if there's an apocalyptic event, he said that's ethnic cleansing, and you didn't use those words. thinking aloud.
I never said what I would have advised Ben Gurion to do, but I probably said, had Ben Gurion been thinking logically, this is what he would have strived at, something like that.
So, we're out of time, but I also want to reiterate what Katja said. I think it's a very important
Yes.
point, not just for the American campus in the United States. If I could just say one prerogative is, okay, you'll find the final. I'll give Betty the final word. It's very important in the American context to deal with these issues, but it's also very important in the Israeli context to deal with these issues, for many reasons. And Mizrahi Jews are the majority of Jewish Israelis.
No, it's not true.
It's true.
The Russians
But the Russian, and
They messed
that,
it up.
and you know what, that
Half
was
of
a
them are
big
not
issue,
Jewish.
because the Israeli government said, in Hebrew, we quote the government, meaning the Russian aliyah, to prevent the Levitanization of the country.
Okay, I'll give you the last word. And that was, okay, I'll be very brief. If we could just do a group process.
That only works for,
Spirit of But also, yes, I see that. But I also think, if I may, it's also very important for scholars in the West and for Ashkenazi intellectuals in Israel to understand that Mizrahi, or Jewish people from Arab lands, from other lands in the general region, also have experience, up close and personal experience, about the issues that we're grappling with here and what the world is grappling with. So I think a little bit of respect to those people, those stories and narratives, what they went through individually, people around this table, their parents, their grandparents, and others, that we should really take their understanding of things very seriously, and I think that we often neglect it. So I'll give Dan the last question, and you'll have the last word.
It's more a remark, one about this issue of the Soviet Union. One of the things that happened after the opening for a while of archives in the Soviet Union is that several scholars, Israeli scholars, you probably know what Matityahu means, and Yaakov Rifan, that Stalin established a committee in 1943 to plan the post-war period. And one of the things that they found was that the Soviets thought that there would be a major problem with Jews in Eastern Europe after the war, and therefore they encouraged those Jews after the war to leave Eastern Europe for Palestine. Right? And so what was taught in Israel as a kind of Hasamba story, as we call it, how they got through the borders and cheated the Soviets and the other problems that wasn't true. So there was this idea, there was also another issue about creating a socialist environment in Palestine, which started in 1941-42. So, and there was another research on that. So the issue of the Soviet Union being in favor of establishment of Israel starts not only because of anti-British policies. There's one thing. The other thing is regarding Jews from the Arab countries. There were Zionist movements in Tunisia and in Morocco, and so they were not as strong as in Europe, but they were connected with the European movement. I once worked about Hashomer Atzeri in Belgium, and I was perplexed by the fact that they had summer camps with Jews from Tunisia because they spoke French and the French Jews. But what happened again in 1943 in the Zionist movement, you have in Israel, Yochiam Weitz wrote about it, that they suddenly start to understand that a major part of European Jewry, who would be the future population of Israel, will not be there anymore, and therefore they already plan, as from the end of 1943, to invest more in promoting immigration from the Arab countries. So it's not in 49, 48, 49, but it starts in 43, and the results are, of course, after the establishment of the State of Israel.
Okay, last word to Professor Morris.
Oh yeah, as far as I know, the numbers involved in the Zionist movement in the North African and Middle Eastern Jewish communities were very, very small. We're talking in hundreds, we're not talking in tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And in truth, only hundreds of immigrants came from the North African and Middle Eastern countries to Palestine, as opposed to hundreds of thousands who came from Europe. And that's the plain fact. Now, this is less important than the fact that after 48, 49, hundreds of thousands of Jews from Oriental countries came to Israel, and Israel became effectively half European, half in terms of its the origin of its people, and half in North African, Middle Eastern, and later on even also Ethiopian. So this is important when anybody's talking about Israel as a European country. It's a population is only half European and half from these countries, and should be seen in this way as well. I think that's an important point to make. But this doesn't mean that one has to change the history of Zionism to Orientalize it. It wasn't an Oriental movement, it was Eastern European, Central European movement. That's what it was, for good or ill. That's how it emerged.
Okay, so on that note, on behalf of everybody, thank you, Benny. So just a reminder.